here. Our organization is also glad to welcome our host, Dr. Alfonso Porter. And Dr. Porter is the managing partner of Vertex Learning LLC. Our organization he is also a journalist. He's written for the Washington Post and the Examiner, and he's also worked as a public school teacher and administrator. His current positions include the professor in the Department of Journalism at Metropolitan State University and editor of the Denver Urban Spectrum. We also are very happy to have Alfonso on the board of Coalition Against Global Genocide. So welcome, and here is Alfonso.
Thank you very much, Linda, and good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you with us tonight. Before we get started, we would like to thank you for your attendance tonight, and also to thank our sponsors, obviously the Coalition Against Global Genocide, the Denver Urban Spectrum, and Jewish Colorado. Our mission with COAG is to educate, motivate, and empower individuals and communities to oppose genocide and crimes against humanity. In 2018, we had a roundtable, or we hosted a roundtable discussion with leaders from the African American community that focused on awareness, prevention, reconciliation, and reparations. And last year, we presented remembering and honoring 1619 to 2019, 400th anniversary of slavery in North America, with a screening of Slavery and the Making of America by award-winning filmmaker Dante James, followed by a panel discussion and how to proceed today to reach the ideals of equality, respect, and freedom. Originally, these two events were followed with a 2020 conference, a national conference to continue these discussions. But due to our current situation with the COVID pandemic, we have decided to host these virtual forums, 4 of them starting in September, October, November, and December, which we will host our last one next month. And so our prevailing theme has been, what if democracy fails? And more specifically tonight, in commemoration of Native American Heritage Month. The specific topic is America's continued refusal to atone for its complicity in past genocide and atrocities. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists for tonight, a little bit about them, and then we'll provide an opening statement, and then we'll jump right in and they will give you their opening statements. Glenn Morris is an associate professor and president's teaching scholar at the University of Colorado. Professor Morris's areas of expertise are indigenous peoples in the international legal and political arena, public law, civil liberties, and race, gender, and the law. He has been active in the development of international legal standards for the defense of the rights of indigenous peoples for over 30 years. In this area of indigenous peoples' rights, he teaches indigenous peoples' politics, indigenous political systems, indigenous peoples in international law, and advanced indigenous politics. As a graduate of Harvard Law School, he also teaches a variety of law-related courses for the department, including race, gender, law, and public policy, contemporary issues and civil liberties, judicial politics, and a freshman seminar entitled Law 101. Moore serves as a pre-law advisor for the department and is one of 2 pre-law advisors for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Our second guest is Nina Berglund. She is a youth council member, Indigenous council member. Nina is 21 years old and represents as a young Northern Cheyenne and Nogala Lakota woman. She was born and raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and sits on the Earth Guardians Youth Council and is a member of the Indigenous Youth Ceremonial Mentoring Society. She has spent the majority of her teenage years focusing on many campaigns and projects such as Stop Line 3, No More Mascots, and the Doctrine of Discovery. Although recently they have been working to improve and expand her leadership skills, traveling to different training leadership events and speaking across the country and beyond the colonial borders, she is extremely passionate about uplifting and supporting the voices of the youth in spaces where Native presence runs short. And so please welcome our guest tonight. This month, we commemorate Native American Heritage Month. This year's theme is resilient and enduring. We are Native people. The attempted extermination of Native Americans, known as the 500-Year War, and the world's longest genocide in the history of mankind. Yet America continues in its refusal to admit its complicity in the world's worst atrocities. It is estimated that between those 500 years, some 120 million Native people were killed. Hitler's concept of concentration camps, as well as the practicality of genocide, owes much, and so he claimed himself, to his studies of the United States history. He admired and often praised within his inner circle the efficiency and efficacy of America's extermination of its Native people, and used it as a model in his genocidal tendencies. The term final solution was not coined by the Nazis, but rather by a North American Indian Affairs superintendent. So why is the biggest Holocaust in all humanity being hidden from history? Is it because it lasted so long to where it's simply become a habit? Is it some vain attempt to cleanse our collective consciousness in an act as if it never occurred? Today, historians, anthropologists, archaeologists are revealing that information on this genocide is being deliberately eliminated from the knowledge base of North Americans and the world. Instead, has been replaced by a completely false picture that what Native Americans suffer are social ills of their own making. Americans refuse to acknowledge this genocide. We do not want to reveal that there was a systemic plan to destroy the Native people by outright murder and by bounty hunters and land grabbers, and disease through the distribution of smallpox infested blankets, relocation, theft of children who were placed in concentration camps called residential schools for assimilation, and ultimate cultural annihilation. The policy changed from outright slaughter to killing to systemic industrial scale murder, sponsored by government, the army, police, church, corporations, doctors, judges, and common people throughout the United States who were complicit in this killing machine. An elaborate campaign has covered up this genocide, which was engineered at the highest levels of power in the United States, and this cover-up continues today. In the residential schools, many eyewitnesses have recently come forward to describe these atrocities. They call these places death camps, where according to government records, nearly half of those innocent children who attended those schools either died or disappeared as if they never existed. All of us Americans are heirs to the fruits of this murderous system, and we have blood on our hands. If people are sincere about preventing genocide, they must remember it. History must be told as it really happened in all of its tragic details. It's not good enough just to remember genocide took place. We have to remember the larger question. And that is, isn't it time to uncover the truth and force this nation at long last to face up to what it has done? And violent corruption needn't really define us. We can say things like, well, yeah, it happened, and we can feign some level of shame about it. We repudiate the greed. We recognize and condemn the evil, and we see how the harm has been perpetrated. But 500 years later, we intend to mean something else and present that to the world. So what kind of moral schizophrenia is it that allows us to shout at the top of our national voice for all the world to hear that we live up to our commitment to the devotion of human rights, when every page of our untold history deny the truth of the Native American experience that stands to contradict the lies through their still unheard voices. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present our guest to you once again, Dr. Glenn Morris, and I apologize, and Nina Berglund. Let's have an opening statement, if you will, from Dr. Morris.
Bujong katapi no ikana tapuishi mana tuishi katulu kushilapa. Winishi. I greet you in the language of my father, Shawnee, from the Shawnee Nation, and acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional territories and homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute Nations. And it's my distinct pleasure and honor to be with you tonight, Alfonso and Nina. Look forward to hearing your words, especially as a young Indigenous woman. Those are voices that we don't hear very often. And I think that it's essential to this discussion to bring us out of our stupor and the suggestion that genocide against Native peoples in this hemisphere should be placed in the past tense. This is an ongoing genocide. This is a genocide that has never stopped. And the reason that I think, and the fact that this discussion tonight is happening in Native American Heritage Month, the month in which all things Native are dumped in this society, to remember once a year in the same seasonal period as Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, the national holiday to gluttony, in which the country gives thanks for taking our homeland from us. And so tonight, this discussion was supposed to be about democracy and how democracy might be being lost. And we needn't really focus on the issues of this conversation tonight to dwell on how democracy might be being lost. All one need do is turn on the television every single day. But Native people don't need lessons about democracy and how to nurture and cultivate democracy. Democracy existed in our homeland here long before Columbus ever got lost and showed up here. We had systems of democracy from the Haudenosaunee, from the Delaware Confederacy, from other confederations in what we call Turtle Island. And so we have much still to teach about democracy. And it's not what Native people have experienced from this country. And I want to make a distinction very early on in this discussion about the difference between majoritarianism and self-determination. Because in this majoritarian system, Native people will always be in the margin. And that's a consequence of the genocide that you've already opened with the discussion of, Alfonso, that we once were the majority in our own homelands and have now been reduced to less than 0.5% of the population that now occupies our homelands. And so if democracy means majoritarianism, we will always be the losers in that system. But if democracy means self-determination, as Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, that is that any government derives its powers from the consent of the governed, then it's incumbent upon democratic processes and systems and people of goodwill to ensure that Indigenous peoples continue to have the right to express our self-determination in the international legal sense of the term, and fight against genocide and fight against cultural ethnocide, even today as we speak. And we can get into the details of that as we continue our conversation. But those are my opening remarks, my opening provocations, I'll say. And I look forward to hearing Nina's remarks.
Thank you very much, Glenn. That was an excellent opening. And at this point, we'd like to turn it over to our young friend, Nina. So Nina, would you please?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. We can.
Okay. Ampeti washte medakyapi wanashti tawachubri hemie na washituyan bergatyapi. Ampeti kiwe mi tante washi na betu zapi. Hello everyone. My name is Nina Bergman. Like I was introduced, I'm 21 years old. I currently live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm an enrolled member of the Northern Cheyenne Nation, and I'm also Lakota, which is the language that I opened with today.
Nina, yeah, hold it closer to your mouth, please. Hold it closer to your
sorry.
There you go. That's better.
Okay. Like I said, I apologize. I've had a little bit of problems here. So I was invited here to speak, I guess, as a youth perspective about the work that I've been able to accomplish with the help of my family here in the past couple of years. Focusing on the doctrine of discovery has been a really big thing that has caught my attention just for the fact of how how the things that I've learned in school, being a young person, going through the United States public school system, and hearing all of the lies that they had told us since I was younger, learning the real history, it really kind of opened my eyes into how much we didn't learn, how much we they kind of hid from us. And so that's why I got so interested in learning more about the history and the real things that are occurring here today, that we see examples of all over the country and the nation and the world, of this continued genocide. And, blood quantum being one of them, erasure and, of Native people and Indigenous people around the world. And so, I'm really interested and excited to hear where this conversation will lead, because being a young person, I feel like I have a very unique perspective when it comes to viewing the future, because ultimately it is my future. And so, thank you. And also I apologize for the whole sound thing, but I hope this works.
Yeah, that's fine, Nina. Just make sure that you hold it steady, okay? If you just hold it steady, we can hear you. Because if you move it, it goes in and out, okay? All right, thank you so much. And again, welcome. Listen, in listening to your opening remarks, one might get a feeling of nihilism within the Native population, and that is perhaps a sense of helplessness and lovelessness and hopelessness. But we know that that's not true. If you recognize those within your communities, how are you working to address this kind of widespread, because as Glenn mentioned, this genocide didn't stop. This is still something that's going on. And even Nina, in your opening remarks as a young 21-year-old, you're now saying to us, in school, you were never afforded the opportunity to learn the truth. And so how do we begin to dismantle all of that and begin to heal the wounds that have been created that are so deep? Either one of you guys.
I defer to Nina for a moment. I'd like to hear what she has to say first.
So Nina, how do we start to rebuild, particularly given the fact that there's considerable miseducation or non-education of the issues, and the actual act of sweeping it under the rug as if it never happened. So where is the starting point?
I feel like that is something that as a young person I've been trying to figure out, just due to the fact of when you bring forward this history, it opens up a lot of wounds, whether it's in our own communities, it's non-Indigenous people, allies alike. I feel like there's a lot of really heavy feeling that comes with it, and that's a reason why people don't want to talk about it. It's a reason why it gets swept under the rug so easily, is because it brings up so much emotion. And I know, like, within myself, when I get to start to talking to someone, it becomes a little bit too much, and I need to realize that. I have been very fortunate, and also at the same time very unfortunate, to have to do my own research into the deep dark history, which I think it just becomes the same cycle of people not being able to talk about it. And I find that time and time again, because I know specifically in our Native communities that we see many examples of historical trauma. When you bring up what had happened with the boarding school era, when you bring up, people being, like, children getting taken from their families, it brings up a lot of really hard emotion. And when I talk to non-Indigenous and specifically white people, I have a sense of guilt that I feel from them. I'm so sorry. I wish there was something I can do. This has happened in the past. How can this, what can I do now? And I think it's just taking that time to really learn, and to know that this was not your fault, that this is none of our fault, but this is our responsibility. And I think as a young person, that's one of the one of the lessons I really want to teach other young people, is that whether you're Native, non-Native, BIPOC, whatever you are, that none of this is your fault. But your ancestors were able to overcome the atrocities and overcome the adversities that were put in front of them in order for you to be here. And so that it is our inherent responsibility to teach one another, to teach ourselves, and to unlearn a lot of the things that we've been taught since a young age. And so learning more about where we come from, who we are, who our people are, as a collective, global people, and also just our own personal family trees. There's many places to start, and I think conversations like this is one of them.
Very good. Thank you.
I'm inspired by Nina's words, because she said a few things that I had intended to say, and I just want to amplify them. That I was raised in a different generation than she was. I was raised in the American Indian movement in a time when there was a renaissance. My father's generation was that boarding school generation that you talked about, Alfonso. He joined the military to escape the crushing poverty and desperation that those times brought. And so I was raised in the period of Wounded Knee too, in the 1970s and the 1980s, and that inspired some of our work to go to the United Nations, to go into the international arena, to fight for the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that I had the honor and privilege of helping to draft. And so, but during those times, we had to always remind ourselves of the lessons of our ancestors, as Nina was suggesting. My dad's from the Shawnee Nation. They were relocated 4 times in 70 years, marched across the country in the middle of winter, being killed and starved to death. And as Nina said, if they could do that so that we could be here today, how can we do less? How can we give up? How can we surrender? We will not. This is our homeland. This will always be our homeland. Regardless of who the invader president is, this will always be our homeland. And we're not surrendering it. We're not giving it up. And so I'm inspired when young people like Nina fight against Pipeline 3, when we were up at Standing Rock fighting against the Dakota Access Pipeline. I was inspired by the tens of thousands of Native people who came from all over Turtle Island to stand up and say, we're not taking this genocide or ecocide. What the hell happened?
We still have you.
Okay, I lost my screen here. I can't see. Okay.
Yeah, we can still see you.
Okay, sorry. My screen went black for a minute. I thought I had a power outage here. So at any rate, I don't believe that nihilism has taken over the Indian world. Certainly, there are people who who have despair and who find consolation in alcohol or drugs, or even we have the highest suicide rate in the hemisphere. And so, but as Nina said, we take solace in the fact that in the period in which I was raised, we had a resurgence, a renaissance of our spirituality, of our traditionalism, to teach us those ways again. And so I developed a reading list that I hope will be distributed to people who are watching. And some of the readings are very, very difficult. They're very tragic, and they can be debilitating. But some of them are inspirational. So the writings of Winona LaDuke, or the writings of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who teach us how to live in this place. And Nina's a little more generous than I am, because some of the enduring crimes of genocide that are being perpetrated today, there are beneficiaries of those crimes, and they live next door to you. Mm-hmm. And they live next door to me. And they're oblivious to the privilege that they have of the genocide that took place, so that they could live in their suburban developments, or have jobs in the skyscrapers in downtown Denver or Minneapolis. And so this is a difficult discussion to have, because the entire legal system, the entire property system of the United States of America is rooted in genocide and white racist supremacy. And until this country comes to grips with that, there is not going to be conciliation. I don't say reconciliation. There cannot be reconciliation, because before there can be reconciliation, there must be conciliation. And there has never been conciliation between this country and Native people. And so that's the question before this country. Is it going to have conciliation with the original peoples of this land? And that's how I would respond to your initial question.
Glenn, that's very powerful and very emotional. And I kind of want to get back to some of the things you said, because I like, certainly as a moderator, I like for the conversations to flow unscripted. And and I think it brings out how we really feel. And I really felt what you said, and I felt what Nina said. When I was a college student here at MSU 35 years ago or so, we were talking about conditions on Native lands. And there was a recording of a young man who talked about his experience in those schools. And he could barely contain himself. I mean, he would pause quite often, it seemed to be wiping tears away, and extremely emotional. And one thing that he said that really made me sit up straight, and I really didn't get it until later. And he said he talked about the nuns in the school, and the behavior towards them, and the indoctrination, and the wiping away of cultural considerations. And he wound up saying I don't know where she is today, but I hope she's dead and that her soul is rotting in hell. And I sat up in my seat and I thought, my God, what in the world is going on in these institutions? Because that had been the first time I had heard anything so powerful. So can you please talk to me about how we can go about ensuring that we begin to dismantle some of these mistruths through the education system? Is it possible? Is there the will to do it? And if so, how do we start? That's a lot. You want to go ahead and take that, Glenn, or?
Well, I'd always like to hear Nina first, and then I can go.
Well, Nina, and then before you start, the young man. I mean, I still hear his voice 35 years later. I still hear the pain in that young man's voice, and for him to say, "I hope she's dead and that her soul is rotting in hell." When I heard that, I felt that he meant that. How can we begin to dismantle all of this through the education system?
Oh, yeah, this conversation definitely is going to bring out a lot of emotions. I know that I think Glenn showed some of those emotions, when we talk about these things. There's definitely anger. When I have to sit and watch movies and hear stories of my grandparents who went through these things, it makes you want to cry. It makes you angry. My grandma, she didn't deserve that. She didn't deserve to get beaten and, stuff just for being who she is. And so I think what everyone needs to do is understand that this process is very long. It's very hard. And, it's been happening for this process of healing, whether we want to think that this is a point from where from right here, right now is the point of healing, would be ignorant to say, because it has been happening. If we look back to how we were raised and looking at our family systems and how much now they've really changed. And if you talk about in everything, or I guess what I can say about, I'm trying to find the words, because this is a hard conversation, to have, especially being a young person, not understanding. I know how it feels when I look at my fellow peers, my young people who they're so unsure about where they belong in this world. And I feel like that is a direct result of colonization. It is a direct result of genocide, where our young people are sitting around their houses watching their family members get drunk, watching their family members use drugs, themselves using drugs, not being able to take care of their children, not having a sense of understanding of who they are and where this anger comes from. And I, myself, am a result of that, because I have lived my life unsure of who I am, because I know, and now that I'm older and I've learned, it makes me very, very angry, because I think about those young children, 70, 80 years ago, who were being taken, and however long they were being taken from their family members. And we can see instances and examples of that today when we think about the Indian Child Welfare Act and how that plays such a huge part on our family members. It plays such a huge part in our families. I work with the St. Paul Indian Education and the St. Paul Public Schools, and so I have to hear stories of the young people, myself, going through the education system, of having to choose, saying, why can't my culture and who I am be prevalent in, how we have examples of all these different other nations. Hmong, Asian was a lot in my community, and us Native kids are sitting in the back wondering, how come we're not able to have that sense of identity? And so, it's really hard because when I bring up these topics in different situations, older adults like to come to us young people and say, what are the answers? What are the answers? You need to give us the answers. When it takes a collective, it takes our young people learning from our elders to find that answer. That we might not get it today, we might not get it tomorrow, or 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years from now. But we know for a fact that just the first step in learning who you are, where, like I said, where you come from, our spiritual beliefs have a way of, having a sense of identity. And I feel like that I'm very grateful that my family and I were able to have the opportunities to learn about our cultural ways, our ceremonial ways, because without that, you feel like you don't belong. You feel like you don't have a place. And so, getting down and going outside, offering you tobacco and praying, whether you want to think there's something they're listening to you or not, like your ancestors really are there for you. And like Glenn said, they went through so much, and so it's our inherent right to continue this and not give up. And so, what I would recommend is looking within yourself and really realizing your place, and that you're important. And I don't know who I'm talking to, but if anyone, you need to find where you belong, because a lot of people are really lost. And I found going to Washington, D.C. and all these places where big corporate people are, that they are very, 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 very lost. And they're very far gone. And so we need to go outside once in a while and look around and, ground yourself. Yeah.
That's quite profound. I felt every word of that. And you didn't get here by yourself, and I don't think you're going to be able to address it by yourself, right? And so all of us as an American community need to understand and know. I mean, for years we've watched the black and white cowboy movies, with the stereotypical imagery. And for most Americans growing up, that was fact-based, even though we essentially knew it wasn't. From a curricular standpoint, and I would ask both of you guys, in public schools, would you advocate for an entire history textbook, an entire series of courses taught in American public schools across the nation on Native American history? And do you think that would at least begin to bridge some of this understanding and to debunk all of the miseducation that's going on all these years? Would you advocate for a series of courses, not just the one-off? You know how we'll do there was a Black History Month and Martin Luther King said something, and we had a civil rights movement, and now we were free. We can't gloss over it that way. I mean, it has to be deep and rich curriculum. What would you say to that, Nina?
Yeah, I went to school at the American Indian Magnet School in St. Paul, Minnesota, and so it's kind of like a small example of what Native-based history and curriculum could look like. And so I'm very fortunate, like I said, to have had that opportunity, but I know that across the nation, that's not the same. And I feel like
the question then is, should it be? Should
yeah,
there be option? I mean, so let's say, for example, it's not a required course or series of courses, but the option to take the courses should be available. And I'm just asking that is, do you believe that might at least begin us down the road to some repair?
I would say yes and no, simply for the fact that I don't believe in the education system and the way that it is set up, because it is set up for white privilege, and it's set up in a way that it is purposely made the way that it is in order to erase and have that constant erasure of Indigenous, Black, brown people. And so, you know, what comes to my mind is when I was learning about these things is that it is extremely hard to expect us to heal in the same place that hurt us. And I feel like that is what the education system in itself is, because like I said, not too long ago, my grandparents were in school system in the same setup, getting beaten for who they are and for how they live. And then we expect how many years later to go back to this place and be the place where we're supposed to learn who we are. I don't believe that school is the place for us to learn where we are. It starts at home.
Wow, this is quite powerful. Glenn, why don't you jump in here? I mean, she has given us quite a bit to chew on here.
Well, there's plenty to chew on. And I want to revert to my slides for a second, but before I do, the short answer to your question is, of course there should be. Of course it should begin in the first grade, of course, but demographically, Native people do not represent a significant political force or economic force, and therefore they can be considered as an afterthought. And let me give you an illustration of that. Columbus Day as a state and national holiday began in Denver, Colorado in 1907. Began in Denver, Colorado. So those of us in the Native community here, we took it as our personal responsibility to dismantle it, beginning in 1989, in the ramp up to the 200th anniversary, or the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Columbus. We did an educational campaign every single year until 1992. And then after that, 7 times we went to the state legislature to repeal Columbus Day as a state holiday in its birthplace. We testified, we brought all of our academic scholarship, all of the evidence about the crimes that Columbus committed, the genocide that Columbus began, the African slave trading that Columbus did, all of the crimes of Columbus. We laid them out before the legislature. We brought our young people to talk about how this holiday hurt them, about having to learn about Columbus as a heroic figure, hurt them in a very real way. We brought the data. We brought the professional studies that indicated the same thing. 7 times we had to bring that legislation. That's a very simple thing for the state to do. And they refused to do it because they can. Because they view themselves as the victors in the war for America. And the victors write the history, they think. And so that's one very small, specific illustration. There are icons all over the city, all over the state, memorializing Indian killers, memorializing the perpetrators of the genocide against us. And it was only with the murder of George Floyd and the insurrection that resulted from that caused 3 of the statues in this city to come down. Finally, it wasn't going to be voluntary by the elected officials. The people took those monuments down. The rage of people took those monuments down. And so I'm not optimistic about curricula. There is a requirement in the Colorado state statutes that says Native education as well as African-American history and Latinx history have to be taught in the schools. Well, let's take a little trip, Alfonso, you and me. Let's go drive around the Colorado school systems and see how many school systems are in compliance with that statute. Because there was no fiscal note attached to that. There was no money appropriated to do that. And so if you go out into the hinterlands here in Colorado, if they don't have to do it and there's no money to do it, they're not going to do it. So there's neither an incentive nor a disincentive for them to do that. But going back to the larger question that you asked about education, I'm not convinced that people want to be educated, because it requires people to get out of their comfort zone and to understand this history, to understand that this was our homeland when Columbus arrived, and this is our homeland today. And so, and believe me, I've been teaching these subjects for over 30 years. And year after year after year, at the end of the semester in my classes, students, native and non-native students, come up to me and say, how come this is the first time I've ever heard this? Why is this the first time in my entire elementary, secondary, and college career? Is this the first time I ever heard of Johnson versus McIntosh? The Supreme Court, the most important Supreme Court case that no one has ever heard of, that ensconces the doctrine of Christian discovery in federal law. That is not only the foundation of all federal Indian law, it's the foundation of all property law in the United States. Because until the Supreme Court of the United States developed a legal rule that said we are going to justify the theft of Indian territories, they couldn't transfer title to one another. And so that case, which is still good law, which in fact was cited by Ruth Bader Ginsburg as late as 2006 in City of Sherrill versus New York. So it's still good federal law, and it's now been exported to every English common law country in the world. So Australia and New Zealand and India and Myanmar and Kenya and South Africa, they all have a variation of Johnson versus McIntosh. But the people in this country are they're unwilling to look into that mirror, because everyone who owns property in this country must trace their title back to Johnson versus McIntosh. And then the question is, if you had the chance to reverse Johnson versus McIntosh, because Johnson versus McIntosh to Native people, that's our Plessy versus Ferguson. That's our Plessy versus Ferguson. That's the linchpin of white supremacy in Native country, in Indian country. And as long as Johnson versus McIntosh remains the supreme law of the United States, this will be a white supremacist country. Because John Marshall, the Chief Justice in that case, admits that because of the European Christian heritage of the invaders, they were justified in dominating and dispossessing Native people. And that remains the federal law of the United States. Now, until people in this country are willing to confront that, everything else is window dressing. Everything else is superficial. It's cosmetic. Because every single ill that Native people suffer, every ill, I can make the argument, can be traced to Johnson versus McIntosh. And everything that flows from that. When you dispossess us of our territory, when you take a land-based people from their land, that's the beginning of the genocide. And that's exactly what Johnson versus McIntosh does in this, with the Supreme Court of the United States.
My goodness. So, Nina, where do we find hope? I mean, given all that, where do you find hope? Where does a young person like yourself, 21 years old, right at the very beginning of this long journey, where do you find hope?
You know, I was thinking as I was listening to Glenn and stuff like that, and I just wanted to, I guess when I can think back to when the Indigenous Youth Ceremonial Mentoring Society, which is a group I'm a part of, traveled to Rome, Italy, to meet with the Vatican about the doctrine of discovery, the first to ever do that, an entire group of Native youth going there to tell them a lot of the things that Glenn had just mentioned, the history. I remember I was sitting there, I was looking around, and I was like, this is where it first started. You know, before they came to our lands, they were here at the Vatican. And, you know, I can just think about my mom, because we had a bundle of sage and sweetgrass, one of our medicines, and I can just picture her in her head like it was yesterday, but she took that medicine and she laid it on the steps of the Vatican, and she said, you can have it back now. All of the pain, all of the hurt going back generations, she said, I put that back now. But this is for you. And I hope that through that symbolic, you know, time of us doing that as a family, it really made me think about how much it really affected, you know, her, my mom, and then it made me think about how it affected my grandmother, and going back great grandma, and going back all to the generations to the point where we were just living freely. And then I think about, you know, my grandchildren, because in our ways, we are taught to think 7 generations ahead. But through that, also, I think 7 generations before, going all the way back to my great grandmother and grandfather. And I think about how they were able to pray, how they were able to think and act and do all this stuff so that their actions are able to flow 7 generations, and which is me right now. So that's how I go about doing my work, is what am I able to do right now in my lifetime, in my short lifetime, that will ripple effect down 7 generations. And so what's able to empower me and able to keep me going is that I think I just can't stop thinking about the world that I want my great grandchildren to live in, because it's not this one.
Okay, so tell me then, and given that, and you're projecting 7 generations from now, what then would becoming whole look like?
I wish I knew what that looked like, but because of this you know, modern world that we live in, we obviously can't go back to how it looked, you know, back when we were living in teepees and riding horses and stuff. That the world is transitioning, and with that, our people need to go with them too, but it needs to happen in our way, that we cannot be forced to adapt because that's what we've been so used to. And so I think to break away from this means of survival that Indigenous people have been accustomed to for the past, you know, however many years with reservations, that we need to become self-sufficient. We need to be able to grow food as we once did. We need to be able to, you know, take care of ourselves, whether that's mentally, physically, or spiritually, the way that we once did. It doesn't need to look exactly like how it did back in the day that we always talk about. Well, people are saying, we can't go back to that way because, you know, the world is ever changing. But what our people need, and what needs to start happening, and that I see happening, is that the joy and the pride that comes with knowing how to feed yourself, feed your people, how to care for one another, and how to really rebuild our wider community. And I know as like an Indigenous person, that includes your tribe, your community, whatever that is. But I think just as a people, Black, Brown, Indigenous, wherever you come from, we need to start working with one another with how that vision that you were just explaining will look like, because we each and every single one of us have a part in that. And so, you know, what I really hope for my great grandchildren, however many down the line, is that they're happy with who they are, because I know that, you know, going back couple generations to my grandmother, they were not. They were taught to be unhappy. And so that's the road that I guess of life that I hope to continue on, and that path of hope is that to just love who you are and to love your people, love your community, love your earth, love where you come from, being, having that sense of identity and being proud of it.
That's really remarkable, because as I was listening to you, I was listening to what you didn't say. And that was some sense of material. I mean, we live in the United States. We're materialistic, we're capitalistic. What you talked about, and even though you said you can't go back and you don't know whether it'll look like what it used to look like, the picture you painted was very much in line with what it used to be. Taking care of yourself, taking care of your family, having a sense of who you are, being proud. Those are the most prevailing themes that I just took from what you said. You didn't say we want electric cars. We want a space program. We want to be able to have a space shuttle, or whatever the case, whatever 7 generations may look like. That's not the picture you painted. You painted a picture of becoming whole again, spiritually, emotionally, with respect to your humanity. That's the picture you painted. And so that's what I think becoming whole looks like for you, right? And I think that's beautiful. Glenn, would you like to kind of comment on what you just heard from her? It's phenomenal.
You sure you're 21? Because there was a lot of wisdom in what you said.
Yeah, I mean, you sure you're 21 years old? My goodness.
And that's the way we are. You're a credit to your family. You're a credit to the people who mentored you, who taught you, for embracing those things and not abandoning them, because we know that everything around you is trying to convince you otherwise. It's trying to convince you to abandon those things. But Alfonso, I want to go to your point, because the things that our sister was talking about here, it might sound flowery and romantic to people, and that's the kind of noble, savage part of people's understanding of indigeneity. But that has to intersect at some point with the material world that you're talking about. Because, and this is the dilemma for this country. There's always been what an author, Elizabeth Povinelli, called the repugnancy clause. It had to do with this case in Australia. That we'll respect you as Aboriginal people, we'll respect you as Indigenous people, until it becomes repugnant to our sense of civilization. Mm. And then that's where we draw the line. So we'll let you dance over there and have your powwows, and we'll let you feed us fried bread, which is not even our food. We'll let you entertain us. We'll embrace the romantic side of you. But the reason that this place was in balance when the Europeans showed up here was because of the lessons that our ancestors learned over millennia. And now the invaders, they don't want to learn those lessons. They just want to move here and bring, it's like people down in Phoenix. I lived in Phoenix for a while. It's like people down in Phoenix who moved there from Ohio. And they wanted to bring all their dogwood trees and all their Kentucky bluegrass, and they wanted to bring all that stuff to the desert. And that's the way Europeans were when they came here. They wanted to bring all their things with them. Well, that doesn't teach them how to live in balance in this place. And there was a great book that was written in 1933 by Luther Standing Bear called Land of the Spotted Eagle, in which he had an essay in there called What the Indian Means to America in 1933. And he said, America does not know the Indian because he does not know America. because he's too far removed from the formative processes of this place. And his roots have not yet grasped the soil and the rocks here. And because of that repugnancy position, they don't want to listen to Native people. So they'll watch Native people dance, but when you start talking to them about, you know what you have to do every day, you have to get up and you have to greet the morning star before the sun comes up. I'm not doing that. Every day you have to splash your face with water to remind yourself that you're a human being and you're not sleeping anymore, because water is life. And we have ceremonies that remind us of that, where we go 3 or 4 days without drinking water or eating in the middle of the summer. And believe me, after you do that, you have a different relationship with water. You have a different relationship with food. But people in this country, they don't want to learn those lessons. They don't want to know the names of the plants that are native to this place and cultivate them. They'd rather bring their palm trees or their bananas from Brazil, or they'd rather be comfortable than honest about where they're living. And that's a very difficult lesson to learn. And it's that tension of paradigms. That's what I call it in my class. A clash of paradigms, clash of worldviews that resulted in genocide. We're here to talk about genocide. And that's part of it, because part of it is what Nina's work is, that her important work of Earth Guardians, of the Indigenous Environmental Network, of fighting against ecocide. And it's not just ecocide, the destruction of our environment where we live. It's not just ecocide for Native people, it's ecocide against everybody. Everybody's going to suffer from that. And so if people don't, and that lesson of the seventh generation, turn on the television and ask yourself if the people in Washington, D.C. are thinking about the seventh generation. They're not thinking about the 7th minute from now, the 7th week from now, the 7th month from now. The seventh generation, that's 150 years. Those are people we'll never even see or know, but we have a responsibility to them. Think about if members of Congress took seriously that. And as Nina was saying, there are tendencies, there are people who are thinking about that. The Green New Deal is part of that, because we didn't live in static societies. We lived in dynamic societies. They were always changing. The notion that in order to embrace indigeneity or indigenous values, you have to go back and live in teepees or wigwams or wigwams, that's ridiculous. That's like saying Europeans, in order to be European, have to go back and live in castles and joust every weekend. That's ridiculous. Societies change, they're dynamic. But the question is, what are the ethics? What are the values that are going to fuel that change? That's the important question. And the paradigms from Native people, including the 7th generation principle, that's why I recommend braiding sweetgrass on my reading list, because Kimmerer says in that book, you can start with small things, with going out in your backyard and appreciating the things where you live, going to the pond near your house and appreciating the things where you live, understanding what is native to this place and what is not, and embracing that. And so there are ways, there are avenues out of this, but it's difficult, and it's even more difficult now. I'm teaching another class on the age of surveillance capitalism. And when we look at social media, when we look at the huge technological imprisonment that is capturing all of us, that's completely antithetical to indigenous values. Completely antithetical. And it's out of control. And so we have all of our children becoming addicted to Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and all of these other platforms. And it's an addiction that is going to destroy them just as surely as drugs and alcohol.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I tell you, wow. I mean, this is a profound conversation. I want to thank you guys. I'll ask one more question or so, and then we'll open it up to the folks who were in the meeting with us. And so, if you have a question, it's a great time to go ahead and type that into the chat or the Q&A. But you know, just like any other peoples, there's a plurality to Native peoples. There's no monolith, not all the same. And so, how can we bring all of that diversity together for a common cause of uplift and advancement? And are there mechanisms in place to do that today? So in other words, to bring all tribes, all peoples, all around the United States who were indigenous, not necessarily singing from the same hymnal, but moving in the same direction. Does that make sense? Nina?
Yeah. I think a beautiful example of that, of what you were just explaining, actually happened for a small moment of time about 4 years ago, in a place called Standing Rock, the Standing Rock Reservation of the Hunkpapa Lakota. We actually gathered all nations for the first time in many, many years. A member of every single nation put their flags up to stand with one another and with the Hunkpapa Lakotas against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I remember that faintly, and remember just sitting there and all the memories that I have of, like, if we were to come together like this and to be as one, to fight with one ideology, which was Miniwi-Choni, water is life, to go off of that simple phrase, and the amount of power that was able to come from that, I think, you know, I still dream about it. I still think about it all the time. And I think that is one of the most beautiful examples, although there was, you know, outside forces coming in, there was the police, there was many different things that made it not the beautiful, tranquil place that we like to think of, that there was still problems. But I feel like that was the greatest example in our modern day time of what it means to come together as one, to think about one another, and to revert to the same thought processes that our ancestors were thinking of like, we are all together in this one place. How are we able to sustain one another? And I feel like
You went mute. You went mute. No? No?
I don't know what's wrong with it.
There you go. There you go. We're good. You're back.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, but like I was saying, I feel like Standing Rock, like I said, although it had its adversities, it had its hard times, but I feel like that was a really beautiful example of what coming together as one, because there was people of all nations there, all ethnicities that came to that one area, to that one space to stand with their relatives. And so I feel like if we're able to grasp something like that in our modern day time, that unity and true sovereignty and, you know, responsibility to one another is definitely possible in this modern time, because it happened. And we've seen it happen globally, that we all came together to say one phrase, which is Miniwi-Choni, water is life. And so I 1,000% agree and think that we're able to come to that reality full scale around the world. It just is going to take a lot of work from us.
Well, I can certainly tell you, young lady, with young people like yourself, it's almost assured. You just keep doing what you're doing, okay? Glenn, now what would you say to that? I mean, I'm touched and moved by the idea of the oneness, but how do we make sure that that's just not a one-off? Glenn? Are you mute? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
I don't know if is it sharing? Can you see my slide?
We can't see it. You hit share screen and then
Yeah, it's not.
go to the box in the top left.
Yeah, it's not showing.
and
Okay.
click that.
Okay, I'm not going to waste time doing that. So I was just going to show a map of Standing Rock, and then I was going to show a map of all of the other pipelines. Oh, here we go. Can you see it now?
We got you. Mhm.
Okay, so here's a map of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and here's Standing Rock. You can see where the yellow dot is, and that's where the camps were to resist the pipeline. And so, and I agree wholeheartly with what Nina said. I mean, it was beautiful. I had never in my entire life, and I've been to a lot of actions in my life. I've been to a lot of marches. I've been, we supported Wounded Knee and the Longest Walk and a whole bunch of different actions. And I had never seen that kind of coming together. And then Trump became president, and he approved the permit.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the momentum was fractured, but it wasn't broken. And it's really a credit again to Nina and her work and the people who are working on these other projects, because here's a map of multiple pipelines, including this green one, the proposed Keystone XL pipeline that is coming down from the tar sands, which is also on Indigenous peoples' lands in northern Alberta, the largest industrial development on Earth. Destroying the lands of the Mikisew Cree. Right now, as we're speaking, the largest industrial development on Earth, bringing the dirtiest oil, melting the sand down, extracting the carbon from it, and putting it in pipelines to come across the United States and Canada. Well, there are resistance movements throughout British Columbia, the First Nations of Canada, and then Pipeline 3 that Nina is fighting against up in Minnesota, along with Winona LaDuke and Honor the Earth and many other people who need our support, who need our solidarity. And when it comes to it, when this Keystone XL pipeline, if it ever gets permitted, needs to be resisted, because this is the line that needs to be drawn and is being drawn. And that's the kind of solidarity that can come together. So also at Standing Rock, it wasn't only Native people who came together. Black Lives Matter was at Standing Rock. The clergy and laity communities came together and marched to the bridge and confronted the police. There were Asian communities, there were Latinx communities, there were all kinds of communities that came by the thousands to Standing Rock, and it provided inspiration to people. And so those are efforts that need to be replicated. And, we'll see what happens with this transition. We'll see what happens on January 20th, 2021. Because maybe it will open a new door to solidarity efforts. Because all of those marches that we were on, After the George Floyd murder, those issues haven't gone away. They didn't disappear just because Joe Biden might have been elected president.
That's right.
And so all of our communities have common ground that we can share.
Okay. Well, here's, I tell you what, we've got just a few minutes left, about 15 minutes, at which time we'll wrap it up for the respect of everybody's time. But here's a question. Would acquisition of or return of quality lands to Native American tribes help demonstrate a conciliation, in your opinion?
First of all, they're not lands. They're territories.
Okay.
We come from indigenous nations.
Okay.
Individuals own land. Nations have territories. We have treaties. We demand the right to self-determination. That's why we went to the United Nations. We didn't voluntarily join the United States. It is the choice of indigenous nations if they want to be part of the United States, but it should also be their choice whether or not to be part of the United States. And that's what those treaties represent. They're not niceties. They're not gifts from the United States. They are international contracts between the United States of America and the Cherokee Nation, the Lakota Nation, the Navajo Nation. The United States it wasn't accidental that it used that language. They were international agreements that without signing them, the United States could not expand. And so indigenous peoples and nations, we use those terms deliberately. Peoples with an S and nations, because those are international legal terms that suggest that this struggle is not over. The struggle for decolonization is not over. And there are hundreds and hundreds of indigenous nations throughout this hemisphere who are still in colonial bondage. And so the return of lands is insufficient. There must be recognition of the international personality of indigenous peoples and our territories and our inherent self-determination rights and treaty rights, and that will represent conciliation. But giving a couple of 100 acres of land back without the attendant international personality, that's insufficient. And I'll tell you another thing that's insufficient is saying I'm sorry. I have a friend, Dr. Tink Tinker, who was a professor at Iliff School of Theology. He said, I don't want to hear I'm sorry from another non-native person or non-native government until there's territory attached to it. You know, saying sorry is an easy exercise, but there must be some substance attached to it.
Absolutely.
So that's what I would say to that.
I certainly feel that. Just got a couple other questions. Would you like to add to that, Nina, before we move on?
I think Glenn worded that very well. My answer would be similar.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Given the obvious influence of our Black and Latino relatives in the recent US election, do you think there's a possibility of greater strategic alliances between these groups and Native peoples to further indigenous goals? What would you say to that, Nina?
Yeah, I think using the election as an example is not just because I don't believe that the election was the basis on our relationship with one another. Although I think that coming from Southside Minneapolis, a couple blocks away from where George Floyd was murdered, and I've seen extreme amounts of solidarity with one another. And I feel like using that as an example of what our solidarity looks like and what it could look like and where we need to go from there. I think using those as examples of how can we all stand together as one to address our issues, because we cannot have full Indigenous sovereignty without the presence of Black liberation. And I feel like those are the conversations that are now being brought into Native spaces, and those are the conversations being brought into Black spaces about how can we work together with one another to collectively reach our goals of self-sovereignty, self-sufficiency, and overall achievement for one another. And so I think, you know, when we talk about standing together with one another, everyone wants to rush to the front. And I see this a lot with white people, is that they come in and they're like, how can I help? What can I do? I just want to help and do all this other stuff. But they fail to sit back and listen to the actual problems and the actual solutions that are being given by Black and brown people. Because if they sat down and, you know, and I feel like we can use that as a basis to help each other's movements, is that we all need to sit back and listen to the concerns that are being brought up and the active solutions that are being brought forward, and then using that to offer our help with one another. And because I find myself in many different movement spaces, and I feel like we don't use that mindset a lot of sitting back and listening and really hearing the stories and then working together to collaborate on what those answers to the questions, and that we always ask each other.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think they always say you have 2 ears, 2 eyes, and 1 mouth. And so, you know, which one should you be using more? So I remember that from when I was a little kid. So I try to use that. So I usually don't speak unless I have something important to say. And I think that's like, a lot of people need to start understanding that, like, not just talking to listen to yourself speak, but actually having something important to say and sitting back and listening until that occurs.
Excellent. And here's a follow-up to that. So what and how might you strategize? How might Native American people strategize to get buy-in from other ethnicities towards your ultimate goals?
Yeah, so I actually just joined a youth coalition here in the Twin Cities to battle and to talk about conversations on police brutality. And there's youth from many different backgrounds, from North Minneapolis, where it's majority Black, South Side, where it's majority Native, and we're talking about the same issues. And because we know these problems occur, we know these things are happening, and that our issues are not separate, that the issues of police brutality are not separate because we are both facing them. And so I think just, you know, this step one of listening to one another, and then it's kind of like a snowball effect of like, how can we create a system of policing that, you know, ultimately helps us instead of hurts us. And so I think that that's like a good example of, you know, storytelling is is a beautiful way of learning and teaching. And so, and that goes back to our philosophy as Native people, that a lot of our teachings come from stories. And so, yeah, I think just taking the time to listen to one another, it really helps.
I have to use my prerogative here for a second. I just realized who that last question came from, and this discussion has gone international, has gone global. Our sister Rengimaria Mahuika from Aotearoa from New Zealand wrote that question, and I just want to say kia ora to all of our relatives in Aotearoa. So Rengimaria was Fulbright fellow with us last year, and so so I really appreciated her question, and I'd like to just address it briefly if I could, because about the election. Because there was some discussion and debate within, especially younger Indigenous circles in our community, about whether it was appropriate even to participate in the election of the invader state, as it's sometimes called, because it just tends to lend legitimacy to that system. I was always reminded of a discussion that I had in Geneva at the United Nations one year when there was a presidential election, and they asked me, well, Glenn, who are you going to vote for president? And I said, oh, I don't vote in those elections. That's their system. That's the colonial system. That's the invader system. I'm not going to participate in that. And there were these delegates, indigenous delegates from all over the world. And so some were from Africa, some were from the Pacific. And one of the African delegates said, hold it. You have an opportunity to vote for the president of the United States and you're not going to? What's the matter with you? The president of the United States, that position is so important. I think everyone in the world should be able to vote for the president of the United States because the ramifications are global. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't want to vote for the president of the United States, if you don't want to vote for your family and for your nation and for your people to try to affect who's going to be the president of the United States, then I'll tell you who to vote for, and you can vote for my family and my nation and my people. And so it really got me to thinking more carefully about being so dogmatic about some of those questions. Mm-hmm. And I got a little more philosophical about it to say, when you're in a decolonization struggle, you use all the tools that are available to you. You use every tool in the toolkit. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that means voting, and maybe it means other things, because the consequence, I just heard before I came down for this meeting that Deb Haaland, the indigenous representative in Congress from New Mexico, is being considered by Biden to be Secretary of Interior. Well, wow. That's a big deal. That's a big deal to have a Native person overseeing the agency that is where the Bureau of Indian Affairs is housed. Where the people who make decisions about the public domain of the United States is housed. Will she be able to make real structural change? I doubt it. But, and one last thing, I know we're running out of time, but apparently the elections in both Arizona and Wisconsin were likely decided by the Native vote. So those are two places in the United States that were instrumental in ensuring that Donald Trump didn't get the Electoral College vote this time. And Native people had apparently a significant hand in that. Again, that's not insignificant. So I'll leave it at that.
I think that's absolutely tremendous. And certainly we should be pulling from Ms. Haaland in that role. I think that would be groundbreaking and history making. Guys, I have to tell you, this has been one of the most illuminating and profound conversations I've been part of in many, many years. So I really do want to thank both Nina and Glenn for all of these thought-provoking assertions that's leaving us with quite a bit to think about. So thank you guys so much. And we also want to thank our board chair, our sponsors, the Coalition Against Global Genocide, Jewish Colorado, and the Denver Urban Spectrum. We also want to remind you that donations to COAG help continue our important work that we do and can be made by clicking on the button on our website, which is www.coagg.org, www.coag.org. So please make a contribution and be generous. We would love to continue to provide these programs. This webinar will be made available on the COAG website as the September issue of Denver Urban Spectrum Now, a monthly hour-long webcast produced and available for viewing on YouTube by the Denver Urban Spectrum. Now, next month, our conversation will continue with the psychologies of bystanders and upstanders, those folks who either protect or stand by and watch. I think that'll be an illuminating conversation as well. So please stay tuned for that. Let's see, we want to remind the names of organizations mentioned by the speakers. I'm not sure if anybody's been taking those notes, but if you have been, please share those with the audience and we can make that available on the website as well. On behalf of all of us at COAG, and particularly our board chair, Ms. Linda Farb, and our generous sponsors, we want to thank you. And we look forward to seeing you again next month on December 10 as we post our final conversation for this year. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our program. We are exactly at 8:30, so it looks like we did something right. Now it's 8:31 now, so oops. But thank you so much for the generosity of your time and for listening and tuning in. Please make your contributions online, coag.org. And we look forward to seeing you again next month. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Alfonso. Thank you, Nina.
Dokshake, everyone. Wopilathanka. Thank you.
Manishi.
Thank you both. This
Thank
was
you.
fabulous. We have so much to learn. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.